Cowboy went hunting for Christmas but brought home an Apache woman instead. Don't rush, she said. Snow was rare in that part of the land, but that year it came early and stayed. It covered the dry grass, softened the sharp edges of stone, and turned the desert into something almost gentle. The sky stretched wide and pale above it all, and the wind moved slowly, as if even it were tired. Jacob Callahan rode alone through that silence. His horse's hooves pressed into the thin snow, leaving a steady trail behind him. The leather saddle creaked softly with each movement. Jacob pulled his coat tighter around his chest, the wool rough but warm. His breath rose in small clouds before fading into the cold air. Christmas was only 2 days away. For most families in the scattered settlements, it was a time of gathering. Small cabins would glow with lantern light. Children would laugh. Simple meals would be shared, but Jacob had no such plans. He had once. Years earlier, his cabin had not been quiet. There had been laughter inside it, his wife's gentle voice, the sound of her humming while she worked, the warmth of shared evenings by the fire. But sickness had come suddenly one winter and taken her away before spring arrived. Since then, Christmas had become just another day to survive. He no longer decorated the small pine branch above the fireplace. He no longer sang the old songs. Instead, he rode out into the hills each December to hunt. It gave him something to focus on, something practical. Something that did not ask him to remember too much. This year was no different. He adjusted the rifle resting against his saddle. He was not a man looking for trouble, but the frontier had grown tense in recent months. Travelers brought stories, whispers of movement in the hills, of misunderstandings between settlers and Apache families forced from their lands. Jacob tried not to listen too closely. He believed in minding his own business. The land was wide enough for everyone, or at least that was what he liked to think. Still, he stayed alert. The morning sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the white ground. Jacob guided his horse toward a narrow valley where deer often passed through this time of year. He had studied these trails for seasons now. He knew where animals drank, where they rested, where they crossed the shallow creek. The world felt frozen in place. Even the birds were quiet. After an hour of riding, Jacob noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the valley, the snow looked disturbed. He slowed his horse and leaned forward slightly, studying the ground. There were tracks, but they were not deer tracks. They were hoofprints, deeper and heavier than those of wild animals. A horse. The marks were uneven, as if the animal had struggled to keep balance. The pattern zigzagged slightly instead of moving in a straight line. Jacob frowned. Most settlers kept closer to town during this kind of weather, and travelers did not usually ride alone through this narrow valley. He scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. No smoke rose in the distance. The wind brushed against his face, carrying only silence. He guided his horse closer to examine the trail. The hoofprints continued toward the frozen creek ahead. Then he saw something else. A dark stain against the snow. He dismounted slowly. His boots crunched as he stepped closer. The stain had spread into the white surface, not large but clear enough to notice. He knelt carefully, touching the edge of it with his glove. It had frozen into the snow. Jacob stood up again, his thoughts shifting quickly. An injured animal, a wounded traveler. Either way, someone or something might be nearby. He hesitated. Turning back would be easier, safer. He could ride home and pretend he had never seen the trail. Out here, a man survived by knowing when not to involve himself. But something in him resisted the idea of walking away. Maybe it was the memory of long-ago kindnesses shown to him when he first arrived in the territory. Maybe it was simply that the valley felt too quiet, as if waiting for him to decide. He tied his horse loosely to a low tree branch and followed the tracks on foot. The trail led toward a cluster of large rocks near the creek. The water beneath the thin ice made a faint cracking sound as it shifted. Jacob moved carefully, listening. Then he saw it. A horse lay on its side near the rocks. Its dark coat was dusted with snow, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. The animal's sides rose and fell weakly, breath shallow but steady. It had not been there long. Jacob approached slowly, speaking in a calm, low voice as he always did with injured animals. He placed a hand near its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the cold air. The horse was exhausted. Perhaps it had slipped on ice. Perhaps it had been riding too long without rest. He looked around again. No saddle bags, no visible supplies scattered nearby, which meant the rider had either left or was still close. A faint sound reached his ears, not the wind, not the creak, something softer. Jacob straightened, scanning the rocks carefully. The sound came again, a weak shift of movement. He stepped around the fallen horse and moved toward the tallest rock in the cluster. And there, partly sheltered from the wind, he saw her. A figure leaned against the stone, wrapped in a dark blanket. Snow had gathered along the edges of the fabric. Her head rested slightly forward, but at the sound of his boots, she lifted it. Her eyes met his. They were sharp despite the exhaustion in her face. Jacob stopped where he stood. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. He noticed the details slowly, the long dark hair partially braided, the careful stitching along her clothing, the way one hand rested protectively near a small knife at her side. She was Apache. The stories he had heard over the past months rushed through his mind. Warnings from other settlers, fearful conversations at the trading post, claims that anyone found alone in the hills might be scouting land or leading others. But the person before him did not look like a threat. She looked tired, cold, and injured. Her breathing was uneven, one arm pressed tightly against her side as if holding in pain, yet her gaze remained steady. Jacob became aware of his own posture. His rifle still rested against his shoulder. Slowly, carefully, he lowered it. The wind picked up slightly, lifting loose snow between them. Her hand tightened slightly around the knife, though she did not raise it. Jacob took one cautious step forward. He kept his voice calm. "I'm not here to harm you," he said quietly. She studied him for a long moment. Then in soft but clear English she spoke. "Don't rush." The words surprised him more than anything else. They were not shouted, not angry, just steady. As if she understood something about him already, about how quickly fear could turn into mistakes. Jacob felt his heartbeat slow. He did not move closer yet. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there, letting the silence settle again. Snow continued to fall lightly around them, covering the tracks that had led him here. Christmas was 2 days away. He had ridden out that morning thinking only of filling his table with meat and returning to an empty cabin. Instead, he now stood in a frozen valley, facing a choice that would change the quiet pattern of his life. The injured horse breathed weakly behind him. The woman against the rock did not look away. And the wind carried no advice, only cold air and the weight of the moment waiting for him to decide. Jacob stood still for several long seconds after she spoke. "Don't rush." Her voice was soft, but it carried strength. It was not fear that filled her tone. It was warning not for herself, but for him. The wind moved across the valley, brushing snow between them. Jacob became aware of how tight his shoulders were. Slowly, he let out a breath and loosened his grip on the rifle. He did not step closer yet. Up close, he could see she was younger than he first thought, perhaps in her early 20s. Her face showed exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp and watchful. One side of her clothing was darker near the shoulder, as if stained by melted snow or something else. She held one arm close to her body, protecting it. The knife in her hand trembled slightly, not from threat, but from weakness. Jacob raised one empty hand slowly so she could see it clearly. "I won't rush," he answered in a calm voice. "You're hurt." She did not reply right away. Her eyes studied his face, searching for something, maybe signs of anger, maybe signs of kindness. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to measure it carefully. Behind him, her horse gave a weak breath. The sound seemed to pull her attention for a moment. A shadow crossed her face. "My horse," she said quietly. "It's alive," Jacob replied. "Tired, injured leg, I think." Her eyes closed briefly, as if she had expected that answer. Jacob glanced between her and the horse. Snow was beginning to fall more steadily now. The sky had turned a heavier shade of gray. If the storm grew stronger, this valley would become dangerous quickly. He cleared his throat gently. "If you stay here much longer, the cold will get worse." She looked back at him, still silent. "I have a cabin," he continued carefully. "Not far, warm fire, you can rest there." The words felt strange leaving his mouth. He had not invited anyone into his cabin since his wife passed. It had become his private place of quiet. Offering it to someone he had just met, and someone others would call an enemy, went against everything the territory had taught him. Her fingers tightened around the knife again. "Why?" she asked simply. It was not an angry question. It was honest. Jacob paused. He had no clever answer. "Because you won't survive this storm out here," he said at last, "and I won't leave you in the snow." Silence followed. The wind grew sharper. Snow brushed against Jacob's coat collar and settled into his beard. He could see her shiver slightly despite her effort to remain steady. Her strength was fading, she knew it. So did he. Finally, she spoke again. "You alone?" "Yes." "No family?" He hesitated. "Not anymore." Something changed in her expression at those words. It was small, but he noticed. A flicker of understanding. She shifted slightly, trying to push herself upright. The movement caused her to wince, though she tried to hide it. The knife slipped slightly in her hand. Jacob instinctively stepped forward, then stopped himself, remembering her words. "Don't rush," he murmured quietly to himself. He crouched instead, lowering himself to her level but keeping a respectful distance. "What's your name?" he asked. She watched him for a long moment before answering. "A pony." The name was unfamiliar to his ears, but he nodded slowly. "I'm Jacob." She did not repeat it, but her eyes showed she had heard. Snow gathered along the edges of her blanket. Her breathing had grown shallower. The cold was stealing her strength little by little. Jacob looked toward the fallen horse again. If he left her here to bring his own horse closer, she might not have the energy to defend herself if danger appeared. If he tried to carry her without warning, she might panic. He chose his next words carefully. "I'm going to bring my horse closer," he said slowly. "Then I'll help you stand, slowly, no rushing." A pony studied him one more time. Then, after what felt like a long stretch of silence, she gave a small nod. It was not full trust, but it was permission. Jacob rose carefully and stepped back, keeping his movements calm and visible. He retrieved his horse and led it gently toward the rocks. The animal sensed the tension but remained steady under his touch. When he returned to her side, he removed his thick wool coat. The cold bit at him instantly, but he ignored it. He draped the coat over her shoulders without touching her skin directly. She stiffened at first, then seemed to realize what he was doing. "You'll freeze," she said quietly. "I've known worse," he replied. He crouched again. "Can you stand if I support you?" She tried to move her injured arm and quickly stopped, pain flashing across her face. "Arm," she admitted softly. "Not broken, but hurts." "All right," he said. "Use your other arm, lean on me." He extended his forearm slowly toward her, giving her time to refuse if she wished. For a moment she did nothing. Then she reached out. Her grip was weak but steady. Jacob felt how cold her fingers were even through his sleeve. He tightened his stance and helped her rise carefully to her feet. She swayed. He steadied her without pulling too hard. "Easy," he murmured. They stood like that for a moment, adjusting to balance. She was lighter than he expected, too light. As if she had not eaten properly in days, he guided her slowly toward his horse. Each step left uneven marks in the snow. Her breathing grew heavier, but she did not complain. When they reached the horse, he paused. "I'll lift you up," he said, slowly. Her eyes searched his again. "Don't rush," she repeated faintly. "I won't." He positioned himself carefully and helped her into the saddle, making sure her injured arm rested safely. She winced but remained silent. Once she was secure, he retrieved a rope from his saddle and gently tied it to the fallen horse's harness. He could not leave the animal behind. It might survive if given care. The sky darkened further. "We need to move," he said quietly. A pony gave a small nod. Jacob mounted behind her, careful not to jar her injured side. He kept one arm steady around her, not tightly, just enough to keep her balanced as the horse began to walk. The valley slowly disappeared behind them. Snow fell thicker now, soft but steady, covering the marks of where they had stood only minutes earlier. For a while, neither of them spoke. Jacob felt the weight of her leaning slightly against him as exhaustion pulled at her. He adjusted his hold to keep her steady. After some time, she spoke again, her voice faint. "You not afraid?" The question surprised him. "I am," he admitted honestly. "But fear doesn't get us home." She was quiet after that. The ride felt longer than usual. The cold bit at Jacob's arms without his coat, but he ignored it. His focus remained on the narrow trail ahead. At last, the outline of his cabin appeared through the falling snow. It stood alone among a few scattered trees, smoke no longer rising from its chimney since he had left that morning. The wooden walls looked small against the wide white land. He guided the horse to the front and dismounted carefully. Then he helped a pony down just as slowly as before. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her, but he caught her gently. Inside, he pushed the door open with his shoulder. The familiar scent of wood and old smoke greeted him. The cabin was simple: one main room, a small table, a bed near the wall, a stone fireplace, shelves with basic supplies. It had always felt quiet. Today it felt different. He led her toward the chair closest to the fireplace and helped her sit. "Stay," he said gently. "I'll make fire." She watched him as he moved quickly but calmly, stacking dry wood and striking a spark. Soon, flames flickered to life, casting warm light across the small room. The orange glow softened the hard edges of winter. Apache's shoulders slowly relaxed as warmth reached her. Jacob filled a cup with water and handed it to her. She accepted it carefully. For a long moment they simply sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, two strangers from different worlds. Bound together by snow, by chance, and by a choice neither of them had planned to make. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, something quiet and uncertain had begun. The fire burned steadily, filling the cabin with soft orange light. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Snow tapped against the small window and slid down the glass in thin lines. The wind made a low sound around the wooden walls, but inside, warmth slowly pushed back the cold. Apache sat near the fireplace, wrapped in Jacob's thick wool coat. Her face looked pale from exhaustion, but the color slowly returned as the heat reached her. She held the cup of water in both hands, letting the warmth sink into her fingers before taking another small sip. Jacob moved quietly around the cabin. He placed more wood near the fire, then brought a small lantern closer to brighten the room. He did not speak much. He understood that too many questions too soon could break the fragile peace between them. Still, the silence felt different now. It was no longer sharp with fear. It was careful, thoughtful. After a few minutes, he pulled a small wooden stool and sat a short distance from her, not too close, not too far. "Let me see your arm," he said gently. Apache looked at him, unsure. She hesitated before slowly lowering the coat from her shoulder. The fabric of her clothing near her upper arm was stiff, as if it had dried after getting wet. When she tried to move her arm again, pain crossed her face. Jacob leaned forward slightly. "I won't hurt you," he said. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. He reached for a clean cloth and a bowl of warm water he had placed near the fire. His movements were slow and steady. When he carefully rolled back the sleeve of her clothing, he saw the swelling near her shoulder. The skin was bruised and scraped, likely from falling. "It's not broken," he said quietly after examining it, "but you'll need rest." She listened without speaking. He dipped the cloth into the warm water and gently cleaned the dried marks on her skin. She flinched once, but she did not pull away. "Horse fell," she said softly. "You both did," he replied. A faint shadow crossed her expression. "He ran too long." Jacob nodded. He understood that kind of mistake, pushing too far, moving too fast. When he finished cleaning the wound, he wrapped her arm carefully with a strip of clean fabric, not too tight. Just enough to keep it steady. "There," he said, "that should help." She looked at the bandage, then at him. "You know this work?" "My wife did," he answered before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air. He had not spoken of her in a long time. Apache tilted her head slightly. "She gone?" "Yes." The fire cracked softly, filling the silence that followed. Jacob stood up and turned slightly, pretending to adjust the wood so she would not see the heaviness in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they felt honest. He gave a small nod. "Thank you." For a while they said nothing more. The storm outside continued to build. Snow gathered against the door. The world beyond the cabin seemed far away. Jacob prepared a small pot of beans and dried meat, adding water and placing it over the fire. The smell slowly filled the room. It was not a grand meal, but it was warm. As he worked, he felt her eyes on him. "You live here long?" she asked. 6 years, he replied. "Built it myself. Alone? Mostly." She absorbed that quietly. He handed her a small bowl once the food was ready. She accepted it carefully with her good arm. For a moment she only held it, watching the steam rise. "You should eat," he said gently. She nodded and took a slow bite. The warmth seemed to reach deeper than just her stomach. He could see some of the tension leave her shoulders. After a few minutes she spoke again. "Men from town, they know you help me?" Jacob paused. "No," he said honestly. "And I'm not sure how they'd feel about it." She lowered her eyes slightly. "They not trust my people." "It's been a hard year," he replied carefully. "Hard years make people afraid." She was quiet for a long moment. "My family moved," she said slowly. "Soldiers came months ago. We travel many days." Her voice did not carry anger, it carried tiredness. "I was looking for my uncle," she continued. "He went north, I followed trails, snow came faster than I think." Jacob listened closely, he did not interrupt. "Your horse carried you far," he said. "Yes," she whispered, "he's strong." The memory softened her expression for a brief second. The cabin felt smaller now, not because of discomfort, but because of shared space. Two different lives sitting across from each other, learning the shape of one another's stories. Jacob leaned back slightly in his chair. "You speak English well." She gave a small, almost shy shrug. "Mission school when I was little, not long, but I listen." "That explains it." Silence returned again, but this time it felt easier. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting gentle shadows. Snow continued to fall outside, but inside the air had grown warmer. After finishing her meal, Apache set the empty bowl down carefully. Her eyes grew heavier with exhaustion. She tried to sit upright, but her body swayed slightly. "You need sleep," Jacob said. She blinked, trying to stay alert. "I can sit. You'll rest better lying down." He stood and moved toward the bed near the wall. It was simple but clean. He pulled an extra blanket from a wooden chest and spread it across the mattress. "You take the bed," he said. She looked surprised. "And you?" "I'll sleep by the fire." For a moment she seemed unsure. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Why?" He paused before answering. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing," he said slowly, "and I've never forgotten that." She watched him carefully, as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she stood slowly. He stepped forward to steady her, but gently, remembering. "Don't rush," she murmured again, though this time there was no fear in it. A faint smile touched his lips. "I won't." He helped her sit on the edge of the bed. She adjusted herself carefully, wincing only slightly as she lowered her injured arm onto the blanket. Before lying down, she looked at him once more. "You not afraid I hurt you in night?" she asked softly. Jacob considered that. "If you wanted to hurt me," he said calmly, "you would have tried already." For the first time, a faint smile appeared on her face. It changed her expression completely. The guarded look softened. She seemed younger somehow. She lay back slowly, pulling the blanket up to her shoulder. Jacob returned to his chair near the fire. He added another piece of wood and watched the flames grow brighter. After a few minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. He sat there quietly, listening to the storm and the crackle of the fire. His cabin no longer felt empty. For years, the silence inside these walls had felt heavy. Tonight, it felt different, not crowded, not uncomfortable. Just shared. He glanced toward her once more. She slept peacefully, her face calm in the firelight. Outside, the snow covered the valley, hiding tracks, smoothing the land into one unbroken white blanket. Inside, two strangers from different worlds rested under the same roof. And though neither of them knew what morning would bring, something had begun to shift. Not loudly, not quickly, but slowly, just as she had said. "Don't rush," morning came slowly. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world covered in thick white snow. Sunlight pushed through the small window of the cabin, bright and sharp against the wooden floor. The air felt still again, but colder than before. Jacob had slept lightly near the fire. He woke at the smallest sounds, a habit he had developed over the years. For a moment he forgot someone else was in the cabin. Then he heard soft movement from the bed. Apache was awake. She was sitting up carefully, her injured arm resting across her lap. She looked stronger than the night before, though her face still showed tiredness. "You should still rest," Jacob said gently as he stood. She looked toward the window. "Storm gone?" "Yes." She shifted slightly and tested her arm. A faint wince crossed her face, but she did not complain. Jacob moved to the fireplace and began adding wood. "You'll need another day before traveling." She did not answer right away. Instead, she watched him as if thinking about something deeper than the weather. After a moment, she spoke quietly. "If men from town come?" Jacob paused. The question had been in his mind, too. "They don't usually ride this far after a storm," he said, "but if they do, we'll handle it." She studied his face carefully. "Handle how?" He turned toward her fully. "By staying calm." She held his gaze, searching for doubt. There was none. Before either of them could say more, a faint sound reached the cabin. Hooves, distant but clear in the quiet morning air. Jacob's body stiffened slightly. Apache heard it too. They both turned toward the door. The sound grew louder, not one horse, but several. Jacob stepped toward the window and looked through a narrow space in the curtain. 3 riders were moving across the snow toward his cabin. Their coats were heavy, their hats pulled low. He recognized them even at a distance. Men from town. His jaw tightened. "They come," Apache said softly. "Yes." For a moment, silence filled the room again, but this silence was different from the night before. It carried tension. Jacob walked back toward her. "You should stay inside." She shook her head slightly. "If they see me hide, they think wrong." He hesitated. She stood carefully, holding her arm close. Don't rush, she reminded him quietly. The words grounded him. He nodded once. All right, stay near the door. Let me speak first. The riders reached the cabin and stopped. Snow scattered beneath their horses' hooves. One of the men called out, Jacob, you in there? Jacob stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him. Cold air hit his face sharply. He stood straight, meeting their eyes. The man in front, Thomas Miller, leaned slightly forward in his saddle. We saw tracks yesterday before the storm, he said. Looked like you weren't alone. Jacob kept his voice steady. Found someone injured in the valley. The men exchanged looks. Who? Another asked. Jacob did not rush his answer. A woman, he said. Her horse fell. The third rider narrowed his eyes. What kind of woman? Jacob held their gaze. An Apache woman. The words settled heavily between them. Thomas frowned. You brought her here. She was freezing, Jacob replied. Injured, I wasn't leaving her out there. The men shifted uncomfortably. You don't know what trouble that could bring, one of them muttered. I know exactly what leaving her would bring, Jacob answered calmly. Thomas glanced toward the cabin door. She inside now? Yes. Before they could say more, the door opened slowly behind Jacob. A pony stepped out. She did not move quickly. She did not look frightened. She simply stood there, her injured arm wrapped and resting against her side. The wind brushed lightly against her hair, but her eyes remained steady. The riders stared at her. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. Jacob felt tension rising, like dry wood ready to catch fire. One wrong word could turn the moment sour. A pony took one small step forward, not toward them, but beside Jacob. Her voice was calm when she spoke. I'm not here to cause harm. The men seemed surprised to hear her speak English. Thomas cleared his throat. How do we know that? She looked at him directly. You don't. The honesty of her answer unsettled them. I travel alone, she continued. Looking for family, storm came, horse fell, he helped me. Jacob kept his posture steady. He did not interrupt. He did not defend loudly. He simply stood beside her. One of the riders looked at Jacob. You trust her? Jacob paused only a moment. She's done nothing to break it. The men shifted in their saddles again. Snow crunched beneath restless hooves. Thomas sighed. You know folks in town won't like this. I'm not asking them to, Jacob replied. A cold breeze passed between them. Finally, Thomas spoke again, more quietly. We just don't want problems. A pony's voice remained steady. Problems come when people rush. Jacob almost smiled at that. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something in her calm presence seemed to cool the situation. She's staying long? He asked Jacob. Only until she's strong enough to travel, Jacob answered. The three men exchanged glances once more. At last, Thomas nodded slowly. All right, but if anything happens. It won't, Jacob said firmly, though not aggressively. The riders turned their horses. Be careful, Jacob, Thomas called over his shoulder. Then they rode away, their figures growing smaller against the white landscape. Jacob stood still until they disappeared over the rise. Only then did he release the breath he had been holding. A pony remained beside him, watching the empty horizon. You could have sent me out, she said quietly. I could have, he replied. But you didn't. No, she studied him carefully. Why? Jacob looked out across the snow-covered land. Because fear spreads faster than truth, he said slowly. And I'm tired of living by fear. She absorbed that. After a moment, she nodded once. They went back inside the cabin together. The air inside felt warmer than before, not just from the fire. A pony sat down carefully near the hearth. Jacob added more wood, letting the flames grow brighter. For a while, they said nothing, but something had shifted again. The threat had come and gone without anger, without shouting, without harm, not because the world had changed overnight, but because neither of them had rushed. A pony looked at the fire thoughtfully. You stood with me? Jacob glanced at her. You stood with me too. Outside, the snow reflected the sunlight, bright and clean. Inside the small cabin, two very different lives had faced pressure together and held steady. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both understood something important. Trust is not built in big moments. It is built in quiet choices, one steady breath at a time. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply not rush. Christmas morning arrived quietly. The land outside the cabin looked peaceful, covered in smooth white snow that sparkled under the soft sunlight. The storm had washed the world clean. No fresh tracks marked the ground. No distant riders disturbed the silence. It felt like the earth itself had paused to rest. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low during the night, but the warmth still lingered in the wooden walls. Jacob woke before sunrise, as he always did. For a few seconds he stared at the ceiling, listening to the calm. Then he remembered. He turned his head slightly. Apache was still asleep on the bed, her face relaxed in the early morning light. The hard lines of worry that had once shaped her expression were softer now. Her injured arm rested carefully against her side, still wrapped in clean cloth. Jacob rose quietly so he would not wake her. He added fresh wood to the fire and stepped outside to check on the horses. The air was sharp and cold, but not harsh like the day before. The sky was clear blue. Her horse stood slowly now, leaning less heavily on its injured leg. It would need time, but it would survive. "That makes two of you," Jacob murmured softly. He returned inside and prepared a simple breakfast, cornbread from the day before and warm beans heated again over the fire. It was not much, but it was enough. The smell drifted gently through the cabin. Apache stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, as if unsure where she was. Then memory returned. "You sleep well?" Jacob asked. She pushed herself up carefully. "Yes, better than many nights." "That's good." She looked toward the window. Sunlight streamed through it brightly. "Today, Christmas?" He paused, surprised she knew the word. "Yes," he said, "Christmas." She tilted her head slightly. "Big day for your people." "It used to be," he replied softly. She studied him but did not press further. They ate together in calm silence. There was no heavy tension now. The air between them felt easier, more natural. After breakfast, Apache stood slowly and walked a few careful steps across the cabin. Her arm still hurt, but she moved with more strength than before. "You heal fast," Jacob observed. She gave a faint smile. "I was taught how." She reached into the small pouch that had remained tied to her belt. From it, she removed a few dried leaves and small roots. "These help," she explained. "Good for pain, good for swelling." Jacob watched with interest as she carefully crushed the herbs and mixed them with warm water. She applied the mixture gently to her arm and wrapped it again. "My wife used to grow plants like that," he said quietly. "Said the land gives what we need if we pay attention." Apache nodded slowly. "Land speaks, many forget to listen." The words settled deeply inside him. Later that morning, Jacob brought out a small wooden box from a shelf. It had not been opened in a long time. Dust covered its lid. Apache noticed. "You keep something important?" she asked. He hesitated, then sat down and opened it carefully. Inside were small keepsakes, his wife's ribbon, a tiny carved wooden ornament, and a simple cloth star she used to hang above the fireplace each Christmas. He held the star in his hand for a long moment. "She made this," he said softly. "Every year she said even a small cabin deserves light." Apache looked at the star thoughtfully. "Why you stop?" she asked gently. Jacob swallowed. After she passed, it felt wrong. Like pretending nothing changed. Apache studied his face carefully. "Change always comes," she said, "but light's still needed." The simple truth in her words caught him off guard. For a long moment he stared at the small cloth star in his hand. Then slowly he stood. He walked to the fireplace and carefully hung it above the mantel. The star looked simple against the wooden wall. Not grand, not shining, but present. Apache watched quietly. "It looks right," she said. Jacob nodded slowly. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel heavy on Christmas morning. Later in the afternoon, they stepped outside together. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The air felt fresh and clear. They stood side by side, looking out over the wide valley. "I leave soon," Apache said gently. He had known those words would come. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow or next day. My uncle may still travel north. I must try." Jacob nodded. He respected that. "Your arm strong enough?" he asked. "Strong enough to ride slow." They walked toward the horses. Her horse lifted its head as she approached. She placed her good hand gently against its neck. "You both stubborn?" Jacob said lightly. She smiled faintly. "Yes." They stood there quietly for a while. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting long golden light across the snow. It was beautiful in a quiet, simple way. "Apache," Jacob said carefully, "if you don't find your uncle," she looked at him. "You can come back here," he finished. "No questions." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Why you offer this?" she asked. He thought carefully before answering. "Because this land is wide," he said slowly. "And maybe it doesn't belong to one kind of people. Maybe it belongs to those who treat it well." She considered his words. "You change," she said softly. "Maybe," he admitted. "Maybe I just stopped rushing to judge." She gave a small nod of approval. As the sun dipped lower, they returned inside. That evening, they shared another simple meal. There were no grand gifts, no large gathering, no loud celebration, but there was warmth, there was respect, and there was something neither of them had expected when the storm began: understanding. Before going to sleep, a pony stood near the door and looked back at him. "When I first saw you in Valley," she said, "I thought you come to send me away." "And when I first saw you," Jacob replied, "I thought trouble had found me." She smiled slightly. "But we did not rush," she said. "No," he agreed, "we didn't." The fire burned softly through the night. Outside, the snow lay calm beneath the moonlight. Christmas had come and gone without grand events or loud celebration. Yet for Jacob, it was the first Christmas in years that did not feel empty. He had gone into the hills searching for meat to fill his table. Instead, he had found something else: patience, perspective, and the reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive quietly, wrapped not in paper but in unexpected meetings. The next morning would bring new decisions, new roads, and perhaps distance between them. But neither of them would forget the winter storm that forced two strangers to stand still long enough to see each other clearly. And long after the snow melted, one lesson would remain strong in Jacob's heart. When fear rises, when tension builds, when the world feels uncertain, don't rush.